Conditions May Apply by CinnamonPinecones. Read by Distracted by Books. Chapter 100. This is the way the world ends. Not with a bang, but with a whimper. And also a few bangs. And a lot of shouting. Lunch went surprisingly well. Neither of them brought up what had happened with Shinso or Kachan, even though Izuku couldn't stop himself from glancing back and forth between the two of them on their respective sides of the lunchroom. Kachan was sitting alone, and Izuku couldn't help but feel like that was his fault, after blindsiding him with his sudden lack of quirklessness. He probably wouldn't have made such a scene if he warned him beforehand, though Kachan probably would have beaten his ass if he warned him beforehand outside of Eraser's watchful eye. He was glad to see that Shinso wasn't sitting alone, and he was even more relieved when a portion of Shinso's group broke off to sit with Kachan. Ruining his own social life was one thing, but ruining theirs was another, and he's not sure he would be able to forgive himself should that have happened. Despite his distraction, he did his best to keep up with the conversation happening around him. Uraraka and Ida seemed to be getting along well. He'd seen them chatting throughout the day since their seats were right by one another. Due to that fact, it became apparent that they had talked themselves out. So when they ran out of discussion topics, they set their sights on him. "So, Midoriya, are you from around here?" Ida asked. "Yeah, I'm from Mustafa, born and raised," he replied with a nervous laugh. The statement, born and raised, was more true than they would ever know, since the city itself raised him more than his own parents had. "You must know all the good hangs then," Uraraka mused. "You should take us around sometime. I just moved here. My hometown's way too far south to commute." "Yeah, maybe," he said a little more dismissively than he had intended. It's not that he didn't know cool spots to hang out at. It's just that all the local spots hosted the local kids who hated Izuku's guts. So he wouldn't be caught dead there most of the time. "I was talking to Ida all day, but I didn't get the chance to ask you, do you have any hobbies?" "I don't really have the time for them. I spent most of my time helping my parents with their business, doing paperwork and stuff. It's really boring, and any free time I had, I spent training as best I could to get in here," Uraraka explained. "Likewise, I spent most of my time training to get into UA," Ida added succinctly. Izuku would bet that was true. As a part of the Ida family, they probably started him out young to take up the legacy. That was actually kind of sad. He hoped this was Ida's dream too, not just something his family forced upon him, but that seemed too personal to ask someone you just met. The two of them were looking at him expectantly, and he snapped himself back to the conversation. Uraraka had asked him about what he did in his free time, right? "Oh, Kami." He couldn't answer that truthfully. Training. Yeah, lots of training," he agreed awkwardly. "Well, I don't know what I expected. Not many people can get into UA with a rich social life, can they? Gotta train your butt off to get in." She sighed as she poked at the remainder of her lunch. "Yes, that does seem to be the trend. Maybe we can find time for hobbies now that we're here. As long as we keep up with our studies, of course," Ida suggested as the bell rang. "I don't know about that. I don't even have the time to finish my lunch," Uraraka joked, but she seemed genuinely troubled. She hadn't eaten much more than Izuku had, and as he shoved his leftovers into a bento to take home, she looked up at him. "You a slow eater too? That's a good idea. This stuff is too good to waste. I'll bring a Tupperware tomorrow," she decided as the three of them took their trays to the tray return. The anxiety in his gut that had peaked when Eraser had left the room abated slightly as All Might burst through the door. Of course, Izuku still had to pretend that he didn't know All Might, but at least All Might was in on that secret as well, unlike Eraser, who, hopefully, had no clue who he was. He allowed himself the barest bit of excitement when All Might revealed that they would be able to wear their costumes for heroics. He had spent most of his life editing and redesigning his hero costume, and now he was finally going to be able to wear it. It was further proof that his lifelong dream of being a hero was becoming more and more tangible by the day. He was grateful that the costumes were stored on the wall closest to him because it allowed him to grab his case and book it to the locker rooms ahead of everyone else. He changed in the bathroom stall like he had the first day, though it took him longer to get everything situated so the locker room had filled up before he got the chance to dart away again. Luckily, everyone else seemed to be fiddling with the various bits and bobs of their costumes as well, and no one tried to talk to him as he snuck his way out. He got two pointed glares from the expected parties, but he ignored them and went on his way. Again, he was the first to the training ground, but unlike last time, he didn't hide around the corner. He didn't need to hide from All Might. He took a deep breath and assured himself that everything was fine before he stepped out from behind the blind corner he'd paused at. "Looking good, young Midoriya!" All Might exclaimed as he walked out into the clearing. He felt a blush rise on his cheeks at the compliment. He'd gone over the design with All Might before he had submitted it, but this was the first time he had seen it in person as far as Izuku knew. He was relieved that he had his approval. "Thanks," he replied as he tried to repress a smile. "You got out here fast. I'm sure Aizawa appreciated that yesterday," All Might responded, not so subtly probing Izuku for information about his first day. He had gotten a text or two from All Might last night, but he hadn't even checked his phone until about an hour prior when he was eating his lunch. His blush deepened at the reminder of both yesterday's disaster and the fact that he had ignored All Might, of all people. "Oh, I don't know. Izuku trailed off, not wanting to either lie or tell the truth to All Might about what he thought about Eraser. "He's a tough nut to crack, but he's a fantastic hero. He's not going to tolerate anything but your best," All Might concluded for him. "He's a less daunting once you get to know him," he added in a stage whisper, not that anyone was around to overhear them yet anyway. Izuku huffed out a small laugh at All Might's antics. He wasn't normally like this when it was just the two of them, and Izuku was starting to realize that he wasn't really all that familiar with All Might proper. The man Izuku knew was Yagi, not All Might, and the thought made him equal parts happy and sad. He was glad to know that All Might was his actual self around him, but it was upsetting to know that he so often wasn't allowed to be that. Izuku knew more than most how difficult it was to put up a facade. It had gotten to the point where he didn't even know who the real him was anymore. He hoped the same wasn't true for All Might. He was distracted from his thoughts as All Might went to greet the next students to come out. "Good afternoon, young," he trailed off as he scanned the attendance sheet. "Shinso and Tokoyami." Shinso responded flatly. "Yes, thank you, young Shinso. Greetings, young Tokoyami." They both nodded their heads politely but said nothing further. The silence was getting awkward, and it wasn't helped by the next few arrivals who introduced themselves as Sue, Shoji, Jiro, Todoroki, and Koda. Izuku supposed it made sense that the quiet ones would get out first, as they weren't wasting time talking or waiting for their conversation partners to finish changing as well. After what felt like an eternity of ignoring Shinso's occasional glares in the stark silence of the faux city, the chatterboxes started rolling out, and Izuku felt like he could hide better behind their conversations. He stayed close to All Might, but still off to the side as the class congregated in the clearing. Once All Might counted 20 heads in the group, he started to explain what today's battle training would entail. Teams were assigned, lots were drawn, and Izuku's heart sank in his chest when it was announced he was supposed to go against Ch100. There was no way this was going to end well. All Might handed both of them a copy of the building schematics before wishing the four of them good luck and taking the rest of the class to an observation room. So he was going to have to fight Ch100. while the rest of the class and All Might watched him. Brilliant! Izuku studied the building's layout and began to devise a plan. It would be best for them to split up. They're on a timer and there's a lot of ground to cover. Kacchan will certainly be on the offensive. He wouldn't let Ida go out and search for them, even though that would be the best use of their quirks. Ida would be able to cover a lot more ground, and Kacchan would be more suited to take a stand in defense. But that's beside the point, because Kacchan was far too stubborn and impatient to wait for someone to come to him. He was also unlikely to see Uraraka as a threat. She looked harmless, and her quirk wasn't exactly violent at first glance. But Izuku had seen glimpses of her at the entrance exam. She wasn't anything to scoff at. She could hold her own against Ida since they both needed close range to fight. The best he could do is evade, but he didn't like her odds against Kacchan. He could blast her away before she even got the chance to get in close. So Izuku needed to take out Kacchan, great, and send Uraraka in after Ida. One of them should enter from the higher level and the other from the main entrance. So you want me to use my quirk to get you up to the roof? Uraraka asked. Oh, he said all that out loud. Terrific! That's not, in fact, what Izuku had meant, but it did sound fun. He was tempted to agree, but he didn't know how he would react to zero gravity, and they were on a timer. Now was not the time to mess around. No, I think it'd be best for you to enter from the roof. Kacchan's going to expect us to enter on ground level, so that's where I need to be, he corrected. A blush spread across Uraraka's cheeks at that. Oh, yeah, I don't know if I can do that, she admitted sheepishly. Can you not use your quirk on yourself? He asked before he had a chance to stop himself. Was that rude to ask? No, I can, but it's really difficult to control, and, well, you were out of it last time, but I tend to end up puking my guts out if I try. I don't think it would be smart to start the exercise off exhausted and nauseous. That's fine. I'll give you a boost up to the fire escape, and you can just take the stairs, he replied, doing his best to sound reassuring. Her responding smile told him that he'd done at least a passable job. Make sure to keep as quiet as you can. You might want to take your shoes off, he supplied, suppressing a grimace at the impractical heels that clicked with every step they made across the sidewalk. Glance into the windows before you pass them and make sure you aren't seen. The plan isn't going to work if they know we've split up. Once you get to the top, there should be a roof access door, but if it's locked, try the window on the fire escape. They likely hid the weapon closer to the top floor, expecting us to enter at ground, so you'll probably find it first. But stay out of sight until I take out Kacchan. Then we can corner Ida and take the weapon, he instructed as they made their way to the fire escape. He was letting himself fall into his Ivy persona, but he just let himself. The confidence was helpful whether it was his or not. Be quiet, find the weapon, wait for you. Got it, Uraraka repeated with a determined nod. Her blind faith in him made his resolve falter, but he did his best to ignore that. This was a good plan. He needed to trust himself too. It was foolproof so long as he didn't let himself freeze up when Kacchan found him. They could do this. He squatted down under the fire escape and looked up at Uraraka. All right, stand on my shoulders, he instructed. He stayed close enough to the wall so that she could keep a hand on it for balance, but once she stood upright, he held her calves in place and stood up as well, effortlessly holding her as he walked over to the fire escape's access ladder. No, don't grab that part. It'll pull the ladder down. It'll be too loud, he whisper shouted as she reached for the first rung of the ladder. Sorry, here? She replied, shifting her grip to the grating of the floor. Yes, you can pull yourself up, right? Yeah, I've got it. Can I jump off your shoulders, or is that going to hurt you? No, go for it, he assured her. His shoulder armor would take the brunt of any damage her heels may have done. Without any more hesitation, she hoisted herself up onto the fire escape and looked back down at him with a smile and a thumbs up. It felt all too easy to return the gesture before making his way back to the main entrance. Ivy was better at making friends. He wished he could just be Ivy all the time. Pushing the thought from his mind, he opened the front door, half expecting for Kachan to be waiting for him right at the entrance. He let out a sigh of relief when he found that he wasn't. The interior of the building was too plain to seem real, which made sense if these buildings were built to be knocked down or damaged in training. But it also made the search that much easier since there was nothing to hide behind. He went about the place methodically, making sure he didn't get himself turned around and waste time by ending up checking identical rooms several times. He made it up 2 floors before he even heard a peep from the other team. And of course, that peep was Kachan's aggressive footfalls. He wouldn't know stealth if it punched him in the face. As good as the emptiness of the building was for looking for things, it worked in reverse as well, meaning there wasn't really anywhere for Izuku to hide either. He briefly entertained the idea of trying to skirt around him and sneak onto the next floor, but with the layout, that didn't really seem feasible. Any movement against the slate gray walls would catch Kachan's attention. As much as he dreaded it, Izuku knew a confrontation was going to be inevitable the second All Might pulled the lots. Engaging on the second floor, he warned Uraraka over the comms before stepping out into the main hallway and waiting. It didn't take long for Kachan to storm out of one of the rooms and lock eyes with him. It took even less time for him to charge. Something primal in his mind told him to run, told him to make himself as small as possible and protect his head and chest, but he ignored it and stood his ground. He was used to fighting Eraserhead and real villains and freaking All Might. He could fight Kachan. He could do this. Predictably, he started with a right hook aimed straight at Izuku's face. His jaw was damn near crooked because of how many times Kachan had pulled that shit on him over the years. But this time was different. This time he could fight back. This time he didn't have to be so helpless. Like any other overly telegraphed move a thug tried to pull on him, Izuku saw it coming from a mile away and used his opponent's momentum against them. He grabbed him by the oversized gauntlet, which admittedly made the maneuver quite difficult, and threw him back over his shoulder and onto the ground. The impact knocked the wind out of him, and he laid on the ground gasping. This was his chance. He knew better than to hesitate, but that same primal part of his brain that told him to run said that there was going to be consequences for retaliating. It had been so long since he had even had the gall to try, and his mind was telling him he was in for detention, and then he would be home late, and then Mama would be mad, and no. By the time he had gotten a hold of himself, Kachan was back on his feet, and his palms were crackling. Izuku knew what that crackling heat felt like. He knew how powerful those explosions could be. He knew how much damage they could do, and he could not let that happen again. He was panicking, and for the first time in a long time, against Kachan at least, his brain chose fight over flight. He ducked under an explosion that would have left his face permanently deformed at the very least, and delivered a swift kick to Kachan's ribs. Having just gotten his breath back, this made him falter. Izuku used the distraction to make it into his blind spot, forcing him to turn around rather than attack again. He stayed low and waited for Kachan to take aim before leaping above another explosion, ready to strike Kachan down as he descended. Unfortunately for Izuku, Kachan had 2 hands and the reflexes to match Izuku's dodging. As the first explosion was still going off, he aimed his other hand up at Izuku and fired. Being that he was in mid-air, there wasn't much he could do to stop the hit from coming. All he could do was brace for impact. The familiar heat and force enveloped him, and his ears had already begun ringing from the first 2 attacks. His back hit the wall, and his panic alongside the impact was starting to become disorienting. Even still, he landed on his feet with his back still against the wall, and thankfully, his costume had prevented any real damage. "You bastard! You've been laughing behind my back for years, haven't you?" Kachan bellowed as he charged for him again. His right arm was out, aimed right at his face and ready to fire. Izuku watched as his left hand pulled a pin out of the oversized grenade gauntlet. His heart sank. He had a feeling that pin wasn't just for show. The world felt like it was moving in slow motion as the orange light bloomed forth from Kachan's hand like a flower. Green sparks crackled over his body before he had fully gotten his wits about him. The ceiling and walls were already cracked. Even if the explosion didn't get him, the debris would, and Kachan wouldn't be safe from that either. Before the blast got too big for him to jump over it, he leaped up and over, dragging Kachan with him. The explosion likely would have blown Kachan back anyway, but he wasn't taking chances on that. The two of them tumbled away together as Izuku had looped his arms under Kachan's and pulled him to his chest. He couldn't hear a damn thing beyond a high-pitched ringing as they slammed into the far wall, and the world returned to spinning at its normal pace. Kachan was starting to struggle against him, so he shifted his hold up to his pressure point and dug his thumb into the flesh until he stopped moving. He slumped back against Izuku's chest, and Izuku wasted no time in throwing his prone form off of him. He took a second to get his bearings back, and once he did, he couldn't help but be disappointed. He was disappointed in himself for freezing up so much and letting everything spiral out of control, and he was disappointed that Kachan went down as easily as anyone else. But more than anything, he was disappointed that Kachan had been so reckless. This was exactly what he had meant when he told him that he couldn't be a hero like this. He had too much hatred in him, and even if most of it was aimed at Izuku, it was still too much. That would have killed him. That would have killed Kachan as well. What the frick was he thinking? He got to his feet and started stripping the weapons off of his opponent before he thought about how that wasn't something he was supposed to know to do yet. Whatever. He didn't trust Kachan not to wake up and go on another rampage anyway. He had hauled all of his supplementary explosives off around the corner before remembering that he should probably alert his teammate. Shit, she was probably worried after hearing that, and he wasn't sure whether she'd been trying to contact him anyway, because he couldn't hear anything over the ringing. I can't hear right now. Everything's ringing, but it's getting quieter. No one is hurt. Just give me a few seconds, and I should be able to hear you again soon. He whispered into the comm because he didn't trust himself not to scream without being able to hear how loud he was speaking. He could only assume that the message was received as he went about tying Kachan's hands behind his back and dragging him to the stairwell where it was less likely for debris to fall on him when he couldn't defend himself. By the time he'd finished that, he could hear an indistinguishable chattering in his ear. Cranking the volume to the max, he was able to make out the words. Sure you're okay? Yes, I'm okay. I can hear you now. I took care of the scout. Have you found the weapon? Is Ida guarding? Yes, and yes, 5th floor, she answered succinctly. What directions do the windows face? He asked. The fire escape is on the west side, he supplied. The south, then, she responded. Okay, I'll enter through the window. He can't take on both of us at once, he replied as he took the stairs up to a less demolished floor. The structural supports were still in place, so he wasn't too worried, but the wall had been blown clear off. There wasn't anywhere he could easily climb up anymore. The stairs were the path of least resistance at the moment. He climbed up to the 4th floor and opened one of the south-facing windows. He slid out of it backward, holding onto the frame to keep his balance as he got to his feet on the sill. He couldn't quite reach the window sill above him. He was going to have to jump. Well, if he fell, maybe he could test out the theory that he could break his fall with a flick's shockwave. Not letting himself get psyched out, he jumped up and grabbed the ledge. With the concrete firmly in his grasp, he let go with one hand and turned his body to face away from the wall before grasping it again. Uraka! Now, he warned. With the building behind him and the ledge in his hands, he kicked off the wall and used his momentum to swing upward, sending his feet crashing through the glass. He landed in the room in a roll, facing the wrong way, but Ida was too shocked to have taken advantage of that brief moment of disorientation. Ida charged at him much faster than Kachan had, but much slower than All Might did, and he wasn't nearly as adept at controlling his momentum. So it was easy to trip him and let him roll away with a loud clanging sound. As inexperienced as he seemed to be at the controlling his momentum, he was more experienced than Izuku had expected with recovering because he was back on his feet and charging straight past Izuku before he could prepare for the next round. Uraraka was mere feet away from the weapon when Ida dashed in and stole it from her clutches. Time was running short, and the other team could still win if Ida was able to play keep away for long enough. Both of them charged after him, but even holding the comically large fake bomb, he was fast. Izuku was fast too, but he was even more inexperienced at controlling his momentum at speeds like that. He was liable to knock himself out if he tried. He could get ahead of Ida if he were gunning straight for him, because at least he would know where he was headed. But in an empty room, with his only clear destination being anywhere Uraraka and himself weren't, Izuku couldn't predict his movements as well. We need to corner him, Izuku decided as Ida ran circles around them. Take the north side. I'll take the south. If he tries to go between us, I can catch him. It took a few passes around the room for them to properly corner him, but once they did, he didn't stand a chance. Just as Izuku had expected, he tried to slip between them as they began to close in, and with only one path open to him, it was easy to trip him up again. Just like he had before, Ida went sprawling to the ground with a clang, but this time Izuku was prepared. Before he could scramble back up to his feet and run after the bomb that had rolled away, Izuku grabbed him by the forearm and forced it behind his back, pinning him to the ground again. The buzzer sounded, and Izuku's heart dropped before he spotted Uraraka standing with the weapon firmly in her grasp. The hero team wins! Izuku winced at the sudden volume. His hearing had largely returned to normal, but his calm was still on max, and All Might wasn't exactly quiet. But it was over. They did it! Deku! He heard a distant voice yell aggressively. End of chapter.